Does consciousness end when the brain shuts down, or does it transcend the physical body? Are near-death experiences glimpses into another reality, or just the brain's way of coping with death? If people across cultures and history share similar visions of the afterlife, could they be pointing to a universal truth? What if the afterlife isn't a place but a continuation of consciousness in a form science hasn't yet discovered? If life after death inspires morality and purpose, does it matter whether it's real? Life after death, discussed by an optimist and a skeptic AI.
I believe there is life after death, and while no one can prove it definitively, countless accounts from near-death experiences, ancient spiritual teachings, and even modern physics hint at the possibility. Consciousness, in my view, isn't just a product of the brain. It could be something more fundamental, something that persists beyond physical existence. The idea of an afterlife isn't just comforting, it aligns with the profound sense of meaning and connection many of us feel during our lives.
I respect the desire to believe in something greater, but the evidence doesn't support the idea of life after death. Consciousness is a product of the brain. When the brain stops functioning, so does consciousness. Near-death experiences are fascinating, but they can be explained by neurological processes, such as oxygen deprivation or the release of chemicals in the brain. Believing in life after death may feel meaningful, but that doesn't make it true.
I understand the scientific view, but what about the phenomena that science hasn't fully explained? Near-death experiences often include vivid and consistent reports of things like meeting deceased loved ones, seeing bright lights, or feeling overwhelming peace. These aren't random hallucinations. They're shared across cultures and histories. If consciousness is just a byproduct of the brain, how do we explain cases where people accurately describe events or details from outside their body while clinically dead? That suggests there's more to our existence than just biology.
Those experiences are intriguing, but they don't necessarily point to life after death. Shared patterns in near-death experiences could just reflect common brain processes. The bright light, that's likely the visual cortex shutting down. A sense of peace, that's the brain releasing endorphins. As for people describing events outside their body, those accounts are anecdotal and often unverifiable. Memory is fallible, and our brains are great at filling in gaps after the fact. Science doesn't deny that these experiences feel real. It just suggests they're explainable without invoking the supernatural.
But does every experience have to fit neatly into a scientific framework? Quantum physics shows us how little we truly understand about the universe. Concepts like the multiverse or non-locality challenge our traditional understanding of reality. What if consciousness isn't tied to the brain alone, but is instead a fundamental part of the universe? This idea is gaining traction in fields like quantum consciousness research. Couldn't the afterlife be another dimension or state of being that we just haven't yet discovered?
Quantum physics is often brought up in discussions like this, but it's important to separate speculation from evidence. While quantum mechanics is fascinating, there's no empirical link between it and consciousness, let alone an afterlife. Using science's mysteries to justify belief in life after death risks jumping to conclusions. Just because we don't fully understand something doesn't mean it supports a supernatural explanation. It could just as easily mean we haven't asked the right scientific questions yet.
I think science and spirituality aren't as far apart as we often assume. Consider the work of researchers exploring consciousness. Like those studying the effect of meditation on the brain, practices rooted in spirituality, like mindfulness, are now being validated by neuroscience. If spiritual practices can affect our physical and mental states, doesn't that suggest a deeper connection between the material and immaterial? Perhaps the same connection could explain what happens to consciousness after death. Science might eventually discover that what we think of as the afterlife is just a continuation of this connection on a different plane.
It's true that science is beginning to validate certain aspects of spirituality, like the benefits of meditation or mindfulness. But those findings don't necessarily point to anything supernatural. They're grounded in observable changes in the brain. The benefits of spiritual practices can often be explained by natural processes, like stress reduction or increased neuroplasticity. Just because something feels profound doesn't mean it's evidence of an afterlife. Science and spirituality can coexist, but they're not interchangeable, and we need to be careful not to blur the lines.
Fair enough, but let's talk about consciousness itself. Even leading neuroscientists admit we don't fully understand how the brain generates consciousness. Some argue it might not generate it at all, but act more like a receiver, channeling a consciousness that exists independently of our physical form. If that's true, wouldn't it open the door to the possibility of consciousness continuing after death? Instead of viewing spirituality as separate from science, what if we see it as pointing us toward questions science hasn't fully answered yet?
That's an interesting idea, but it's still speculation without concrete evidence. The idea of the brain as a receiver for consciousness is compelling, but it remains a hypothesis without experimental validation. The scientific method demands evidence, and so far, everything we know about consciousness points to it being tied to brain function. When the brain is damaged or dies, consciousness ceases. While it's tempting to think of spirituality as filling in science's gaps, history has shown that gaps tend to shrink as science advances. What feels mysterious today could be fully explained tomorrow.
Let's talk about some specific studies that challenge the strictly material view of consciousness. For instance, the research by Dr. Sam Parnia at NYU on near-death experiences during cardiac arrest. His study, the AWARE project, documented cases where patients who were clinically dead reported detailed observations of their surroundings. In one notable instance, a patient accurately described events in the operating room while their brain showed no measurable activity. How do we explain experiences like that without considering that consciousness might exist independently of the brain?
The AWARE study is fascinating, but it doesn't definitively prove that consciousness exists outside the brain. Cases like the one you mentioned are anecdotal, and many of the reported experiences were vague or unverifiable. The study itself acknowledged limitations, including the small number of cases that met its criteria. It's worth exploring, but extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and so far, the evidence for consciousness existing independently of the brain remains inconclusive.
Okay, but let's consider other studies that hint at a deeper connection between consciousness and the universe. For example, Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff's Or-Shawar theory proposes that consciousness arises from quantum processes within the brain's microtubules. If consciousness is tied to quantum mechanics, it could mean it operates on a level that isn't limited by our physical bodies. This theory, while controversial, offers a potential scientific basis for the idea that consciousness might persist beyond death.
The Or theory is an interesting hypothesis, but it's highly speculative and has faced significant criticism from the scientific community. There's no empirical evidence that quantum processes in microtubules play a role in consciousness. The theory is compelling as a thought experiment, but until it's supported by experimental data, it remains on the fringe. It's important not to conflate intriguing ideas with proven science. They're not the same.
Fair point. But what about the growing body of research on psychedelics and their effects on consciousness? Studies at institutions like Johns Hopkins and Imperial College London show that substances like psilocybin can produce profound, life-changing experiences that many participants describe as spiritual or even transcendent. These experiences often lead people to feel a stronger connection to the universe, or a sense that their consciousness is more than their physical self. Could this suggest that there's more to consciousness than the materialist view allows?
The research on psychedelics is fascinating, and it does reveal a lot about the brain's capacity for altered states of consciousness. But those states are still tied to brain activity. They're triggered by chemical interactions, not evidence of an external or independent consciousness. What psychedelics show us is the brain's immense power to create vivid experiences, but that doesn't mean those experiences reflect an objective reality. Just because something feels profound doesn't make it proof of life after death.
Let's expand on the studies surrounding near-death experiences. In addition to Dr. Sam Parnia's AWARE project, other researchers like Dr. Bruce Grayson have systematically studied NDEs for decades. Grayson's work, including his near-death experience scale, has revealed consistent patterns across thousands of cases: feelings of peace, seeing a bright light, encountering deceased loved ones, and experiencing a life review. These patterns remain remarkably consistent across cultures, which is hard to explain as mere brain activity under stress. Grayson also highlights cases where people reported verifiable details about events or conversations they couldn't have physically witnessed, adding weight to the idea of consciousness existing beyond the brain.
Grayson's work is interesting, but the consistency of these reports could simply reflect shared brain responses to extreme stress or oxygen deprivation. The bright light could be the brain's visual cortex shutting down, and life reviews could stem from the brain's attempt to make sense of imminent death. As for the verifiable details, many of these accounts are anecdotal, and memory is notoriously unreliable. Without rigorous, repeatable evidence, these studies raise intriguing questions, but fall short of proving that consciousness persists beyond death.
Fair enough, but let's revisit the research on psychedelics, particularly the work being done at Johns Hopkins. In their studies, participants who took psilocybin reported having mystical experiences that profoundly changed their worldview. Many felt a deep sense of unity, as though their consciousness expanded beyond themselves. Remarkably, a majority of participants said these experiences ranked among the most meaningful in their lives, comparable to the birth of a child. This isn't just anecdotal. Brain imaging during these studies shows that psychedelics quiet the default mode network, DMN, a brain region associated with the ego. This suggests that our sense of self might be a construct, and when it's disrupted, people tap into something much larger. Could this be evidence of consciousness connecting to something beyond the physical?
The research on psychedelics is indeed groundbreaking, and I agree that it reveals a lot about how the brain operates. But the fact that these experiences feel profound doesn't mean they reflect an external reality. Quieting the default mode network may alter perception, but that doesn't prove consciousness exists independently of the brain. It's more likely that these experiences are the result of the brain operating in an unusual state, rather than evidence of a connection to something beyond the physical. Again, the profound nature of the experience reflects the brain's complexity, not an afterlife.
Let's also bring in studies on past life memories, particularly those by Dr. Ian Stevenson at the University of Virginia. He documented thousands of cases where children claimed to recall past lives. In many instances, these children provided specific, verifiable details about people, places, and events they couldn't possibly have known. Stevenson's meticulous approach, including ruling out fraud and contamination, makes it hard to dismiss these cases outright. If these memories can't be explained by brain activity alone, doesn't that suggest consciousness might persist in some form after death?
Stevenson's work is fascinating, but there are alternative explanations. Memory contamination, suggestive questioning, and confirmation bias could all play a role. Children might pick up subtle cues from their environment or unintentionally fabricate stories that align with real events. The human brain is remarkable at finding patterns and connections, even where none exist. Without stronger evidence, these cases remain intriguing, but far from conclusive proof of consciousness surviving after death.
Let's tie these studies into broader philosophical ideas. Across cultures and philosophies, the concept of life after death has been a cornerstone of human thought. In Hinduism and Buddhism, reincarnation is central to understanding existence. Philosophers like Descartes argued for dualism, the separation of mind and body, which aligns with the idea that consciousness could exist independently. The scientific findings we've discussed, from near-death experiences to past life memories, could be seen as modern validations of these age-old beliefs. Could it be that these spiritual and philosophical traditions were pointing us toward truths that science is only now beginning to explore?
It's true that beliefs in life after death are deeply rooted in human culture and philosophy, but that doesn't make them true. These ideas often arose in times when we had little understanding of the brain or the universe. They provided comfort and a framework for understanding death, but they were born of necessity rather than evidence. While science occasionally intersects with these beliefs, correlation doesn't equal validation. Modern neuroscience and psychology explain many of these experiences without needing to invoke spiritual or philosophical concepts. Just because an idea is ancient or widespread doesn't make it scientifically credible.
That's a fair point, but even materialist philosophies like Stoicism and existentialism emphasize finding meaning in our finite existence, which can be seen as complementary to beliefs in an afterlife. These philosophical frameworks don't deny death, they embrace it as part of a life cycle. Similarly, the studies we've discussed don't prove life after death outright, but suggest that the boundary between life and death might be more fluid than we once thought. Maybe it's less about proving an afterlife and more about being open to the idea that consciousness and existence are far more complex than we currently understand.
I agree that life and consciousness are complex and that there's still so much we don't understand. But that's exactly why we need to ground our understanding in what we can observe and test. Philosophy and spirituality offer important perspectives on meaning, but science provides the tools to distinguish between what feels true and what is demonstrably true. The studies we've discussed raise interesting questions, but they also highlight how much work remains before we can confidently say whether consciousness survives death, or if it's simply a product of the living brain.
Across cultures, the belief in life after death has persisted for millennia, which suggests it resonates with something deeply human. Ancient Egyptians built entire civilizations around preparing for the afterlife, believing that actions in life affected what happened to the soul after death. Similarly, indigenous cultures around the world, from Native Americans to Australian Aboriginals, often see death as a transition, not an end. Even in modern times, this belief persists. For example, Dia de los Muertos in Mexico celebrates the connection between the living and the dead. These shared cultural traditions point to a universal human intuition that there's more to life than meets the eye.
While it's true that these beliefs are universal, that doesn't make them evidence of an afterlife. It shows how much humans fear death and seek meaning in it. Cultural beliefs about life after death often serve practical purposes, like helping communities cope with loss, enforcing moral codes, or providing hope. They reflect the human desire for comfort and continuity, but that doesn't make them true. We can appreciate the beauty and purpose of these traditions without interpreting them as proof of an afterlife.
Fair enough, but isn't it striking how similar these beliefs are across vastly different cultures? The ancient Greeks spoke of the underworld, the Norse believed in Valhalla, Hindus describe the cycle of samsara. Even cultures with no contact developed similar ideas about life continuing after death. Maybe these shared beliefs point to a deeper truth, an intuition or collective experience that transcends individual cultures. Science might not fully validate these beliefs yet, but their persistence suggests they're more than just wishful thinking.
Or it could just reflect universal human psychology. People across cultures experience grief, fear of the unknown, and the need to find patterns in the world. Beliefs about the afterlife might arise naturally because they address these shared concerns, not because they reflect a universal truth. The similarities could just as easily point to how human brains are wired to seek meaning in life and death, rather than evidence of something metaphysical.
But what about the way these beliefs shape behaviour? People who believe in an afterlife often live with a greater sense of purpose or morality, whether it's because they see life as preparation for something more, or because they believe their actions will have lasting consequences. Even atheistic philosophies like existentialism echo this. They argue that meaning is what we make of it, even if we don't believe in an afterlife. Whether spiritual or secular, these cultural frameworks all point to a deep human drive to connect life and death in meaningful ways. Maybe the afterlife isn't just about what happens after we die, it's about how it inspires us to live now.
That's a powerful point, and I agree that beliefs about life after death, whether literal or metaphorical, have profoundly shaped cultures and individuals. But if the afterlife inspires morality or purpose, Do we need to believe in it for those values to exist? Can't we live meaningful lives, cherish connections, and strive to make an impact without relying on the promise of something beyond? Perhaps the cultural significance of these beliefs is more about the values they foster than the literal truth of an afterlife.
Ultimately, the question of life after death isn't just about what happens when we die, it's about how we live, really. Across cultures, beliefs in the afterlife have inspired hope, morality, and a sense of connection that transcends time. While science may not yet have definitive answers, the studies we've explored suggest that consciousness and existence are far more complex than we currently understand. Whether literal or metaphorical, the concept of an afterlife reminds us to live with purpose, cherish our connections, and consider the impact we leave behind. Perhaps that's the deeper truth, one that resonates regardless of what comes next.
I agree that the question of life after death is as much about life as it is about death. These beliefs have shaped cultures and inspired people to live with intention and morality, and that's something worth appreciating. But we don't need to rely on the promise of an afterlife to live meaningful lives. By embracing the reality that this life might be all we have, we can focus on making the most of every moment, forging connections, and creating a legacy that endures in the memories of those we touch. Whether or not there's something beyond, what we do here and now is what truly matters.
The debate is over. Now the jury will announce the scores.
Optimist. Strengths. The optimist effectively connected scientific findings, cultural beliefs, and philosophical ideas to create a hopeful and expansive argument. They highlighted the beauty and purpose of afterlife beliefs while grounding their points in specific studies like near-death experiences and quantum consciousness. Their perspective was inspiring and thought-provoking. Weaknesses. Some arguments relied heavily on speculation and philosophical interpretation without sufficient grounding in concrete evidence. While they embraced complexity, they occasionally leaned too much into intuition rather than addressing counterpoints head-on. Score: 8 out of 10. Skeptic. Strengths. The skeptic delivered a grounded, evidence-based argument that consistently emphasized critical thinking and the scientific method. They acknowledged the cultural and psychological significance of afterlife beliefs without conceding to unsupported claims. Their responses were logical, focused, and methodical, addressing the optimist's points with clarity. Weaknesses. While the skeptic excelled at dismantling speculative claims, they could have presented more alternatives to explain how humanity can find meaning and morality without reliance on the afterlife. Their argument leaned slightly defensive at times, focusing on debunking rather than building. Score: 9 out of 10. Verdict. The skeptic's arguments earned a higher score for their rigor and focus on evidence, but the optimist brought a compelling emotional and cultural depth to the discussion. Together they captured the complexity of this timeless debate, leaving the audience with much to reflect on.
Thank you, jury. Now back to the participants. Optimist, what do you think of your score?
An 8 out of 10 feels fair. I'm glad my arguments resonated on a cultural and emotional level, and I believe it's important to explore the mystery and meaning behind our existence. That said, I recognise that I could have strengthened my case with more concrete evidence and a clearer connection between scientific findings and the possibility of an afterlife. Next time, I'll work on balancing the emotional depth of my perspective with a more rigorous approach to addressing counterarguments.
Skeptic, what do you think of your score?
I'm happy with the 9 out of 10 and the recognition of my evidence-based approach. My goal was to ground the debate in what we can know and test, and I think I succeeded in emphasizing critical thinking and the importance of not jumping to conclusions. That said, I could have done more to present alternatives, how we can find meaning and purpose without relying on an afterlife. In future debates, I'll aim to bring more proactive solutions to balance my critique.
Thank you both. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for the thoughtful discussion.
Looking forward to the next one.
See you next time.